The most dangerous man in Seoul walked into a jewelry store to buy a ring for a woman he didn't love. He walked out ready to burn the city down for the woman he left behind. Dang, Kwang-sun had ordered executions without hesitation. Yet standing inside Seoul's most secure jewelry boutique, surrounded by bulletproof glass and armed guards, the red velvet box in his hand suddenly felt more dangerous than any weapon he'd ever carried. The showroom hummed with controlled menace. High-security cases, surveillance cameras that tracked every movement, private rooms where deals were sealed in blood and diamonds, a place where power didn't apologize for itself. He'd chosen this boutique precisely because it catered to men like him, men whose money came with questions no one dared ask. Tonight was meant to be tactical. Select the ring that screamed alliance, not affection. Secure the truce with the Han clan. Leave with his empire intact and his heart untouched. A transaction like any other. But when Kwang-sun raised his eyes from the case of flawless stones, the ground beneath his carefully constructed world cracked open. Behind the counter stood a woman he had destroyed to save. Bianca Roy, the only person who had ever looked past the silver hair and ink-marked throat to see the man underneath the monster. Her hair was longer now, falling in soft waves instead of the practical style she'd worn when paint covered her hands and dreams filled her eyes. She dressed differently, a crisp professional uniform beneath the boutique's branded jacket. Contained, careful. Nothing like the art teacher with watercolor-stained fingers who used to trace the patterns of his tattoos and ask him to imagine a different life. And beside her, half hidden behind the counter's edge, stood a little girl, small hands clutching a sketchbook. Dark eyes that studied him with unsettling recognition, not fear. A child who couldn't be more than 7 years old. The air between them turned to ice and gasoline, waiting for a spark. Recognition flickered in Bianca's eyes, first shock, then something that looked like preparation for impact. "Welcome to eternal brilliance," she said, her voice steady and rehearsed, the kind reserved for dangerous customers. Then her professional mask slipped for just a heartbeat. Kwang Sunday. His name in her mouth felt like a knife he'd left buried in her chest. He tried to respond, but his voice, the same voice that had ordered men to their deaths without wavering, abandoned him completely. The little girl tugged at Bianca's sleeve. "Mama," she whispered, still staring at his neck. "Why does that man have my dream flower on his skin?" Bianca's hand moved instinctively to the child's shoulder, protective and possessive. "He's just a customer, Beatrice. Don't stare. Just a customer. Not the man who had held her while she cried over her father's death. Not the lover who had traced her spine with calloused fingers and promised her forever in the language of touch, because he couldn't say the words. Just a customer. As if 5 years could erase the violence of their love and the brutality of their ending." Kwang-sun crouched slightly, his tattooed hand gripping the edge of the display case for balance. He found a smile that felt like pulling stitches from an old wound. "Hello, little one. What's your name?" The girl Beatrice pressed closer to her mother but didn't look away from his throat, from the geometric mandala that crawled up his neck like sacred scripture written in ink and pain. "Beatrice," she answered softly, then held up her sketchbook. "I draw it sometimes, the flower. It comes to me when I sleep." A name that felt like an accusation. A drawing that looked like evidence. A timeline that added up to truth he'd never allowed himself to imagine. The diamond meant for the Han clan's daughter, flawless, cold, transactional, suddenly looked obscene in its velvet prison. A ring meant for someone who saw him as a strategic asset, not a man. Someone who would wear his name like armor, not tenderness. None of it mattered anymore, because standing behind that counter was the only woman who had ever asked him to choose love over survival. And now, with a ring meant for his enemy's daughter burning in his palm, Kwang-sun realized he had made the wrong choice 5 years ago, and she had paid the price in ways he was only beginning to understand. If you've ever wondered what happens when the past you buried comes back to claim you, this story might change how you see sacrifice forever. Hit subscribe now and join our community of storytellers. Comment below with where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to where Kwang-sun's war with himself really began. 5 years earlier, Kwang-sun wasn't the kind of man who frequented art galleries. He was 28. Ascending the ranks of the Silver Lotus Syndicate through violence and strategy, with ink still fresh on his neck and blood still fresh on his conscience. That autumn evening, Seoul had erupted in protests, students blocking streets, police firing tear gas, chaos that turned the city into a battlefield. Kwang-sun had ducked into a small community center in Hongdae, more to avoid police sweeps than seek shelter. The place was nearly empty, just an elderly janitor mopping floors and a young woman teaching art to children who'd been abandoned by the chaos outside. He chose a corner in the shadows, checking his phone for orders from his boss. The message from that morning's meeting still burned in his mind. Prove your loyalty. Eliminate the witness. No exceptions. He was so focused on the impossible choice ahead that he didn't notice the woman approach until she placed a cup of tea beside him. "You look like you're carrying the world," she said, her voice gentle but unafraid. "Or maybe running from it." Bianca wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way the syndicate's hostesses were manufactured to be. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, dried paint under her fingernails, hands that were created instead of destroyed. But when she smiled, Kwang-sun forgot about the orders and the blood oath and the fact that men like him didn't get to want things that were good. "I didn't order tea," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "I didn't ask if you did," she replied, sitting across from him without fear. "You looked like you needed it." He learned she taught art to underprivileged kids, filling their worlds with color when everything else was gray. She showed him watercolors of soul from perspectives he'd never considered, not the territories and turfs and power structures he navigated, but the beauty that existed in the margins, children laughing in the playground, elderly couples holding hands on park benches, moments of grace in a city he'd only known as a battlefield. Kwang-sun told her nothing about his real work. He invented a story about being a security consultant, a lie that tasted like ash. But when she asked what he really wanted, the truth escaped before he could stop it. "To not be what everyone expects me to be." She didn't press for details. Instead, she handed him a brush. "Then paint something unexpected." He'd never held a paintbrush before. His hands were made for violence, scarred knuckles, tattoos that marked him as property of the syndicate. But Bianca guided his hand across paper, and for 20 minutes, Kwang-sun forgot he was a weapon. "You have gentle hands when you choose to," she said quietly. They stayed until the center closed, then walked through streets, still smoky from tear gas, talking as if they existed outside the rules that governed their separate worlds. He should have walked away that night, but 3 days later he came back, and then again, and again. For 6 months, Kwang-sun lived 2 lives. By day, he was the White Wolf enforcer, killer, the man whose arrival meant someone was about to disappear. By night, in the small apartment Bianca rented above a bookstore, he was just Kwang Sunday, a man who learned to paint, who listened to her dreams of opening a real school, who let himself imagine a future that didn't end in violence. She never asked about the ink on his skin or the scars on his knuckles. She saw him, not the monster the syndicate had created. The night he told her he loved her, she traced the mandala on his neck. "This pattern," she whispered. "It's beautiful and terrifying, just like you." He should have known it couldn't last. Men like him didn't get redemption. They got consequences. But standing in that jewelry store, watching his daughter draw the symbol of his damnation, Kwang-sun understood something he'd been too much of a coward to see 5 years ago. Walking away hadn't saved Bianca. It had just made her survive him alone. And now his past and his future were standing on opposite sides of a glass counter, waiting for him to finally make the choice that mattered. The boutique security system registered Deng Kwang-sun's arrival 3 seconds before he reached the entrance. Cameras swiveled. The manager's hand moved instinctively toward the panic button beneath her desk, not to press it, but to acknowledge its presence. A reminder that even in a place built to serve the wealthy and dangerous, some customers required a different protocol entirely. When the frosted glass doors opened, silence didn't fall. It detonated. Kwang-sun moved like a man who'd forgotten how to apologize for the space he occupied. His silver hair caught the boutique's carefully calibrated lighting, turning it into something that looked like frost or ash or the color of old scars. The burgundy suit he wore was custom-tailored, expensive enough to buy a small car, but it was the ink crawling up his neck that told the real story. The geometric mandala pattern that marked him as royalty in Seoul's criminal underworld, intricate, deliberate, beautiful in the way that sacred violence can be beautiful. Behind him, 2 men in black tactical wear flanked the entrance. Not bodyguards in the traditional sense. Enforcers, the kind who didn't carry business cards and didn't need to introduce themselves. Their presence said everything their silence didn't. "This man owns the air you're breathing. Behave accordingly." The boutique's other patrons, a young couple examining wedding bands, an elderly woman considering anniversary gifts, registered the shift in atmospheric pressure and made themselves invisible. The couple pretended to have a sudden fascination with their phones. The elderly woman discovered an urgent need to examine pieces on the far wall. Everyone understood the unspoken rule of surviving in Seoul's luxury economy. When apex predators enter the room, you become furniture. The manager emerged from behind her station, her smile professional and brittle. She was good at her job, which meant she knew how to read danger in expensive suits. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Eternal Brilliance. How may we serve you today?" Kwang-sun's gaze swept the showroom with the efficiency of a man trained to catalog exits and threats before acknowledging pleasantries. When his eyes finally landed on the manager, she felt the weight of being assessed and categorized. Civilian, irrelevant, non-threatening. "Your most expensive piece," he said. His voice carried the kind of quiet authority that made repetition unnecessary. "Diamond. Something that makes a statement." The manager's training took over, her brain switching to the script reserved for clients whose money came with questions you didn't ask. Of course. We have several exceptional pieces in our heritage collection. May I ask the occasion? It helps us understand the narrative you wish. An engagement. He said it the way other men might say execution or acquisition. A fact, not a feeling. To a woman whose family name matters more than her happiness. Show me something that reflects that reality. The honesty was more unsettling than a lie would have been. The manager's smile recalibrated, becoming something closer to understanding than judgment. In her years of selling symbols of love to people incapable of it, she'd learned that at least honesty was something you could work with. I understand completely. Please, allow me to retrieve our... I'll handle this, Mrs. Choi. The voice came from the back of the boutique, from the corridor that led to the private consultation rooms and the workshop where pieces were sized and engraved. A woman's voice, steady despite the slight hesitation before she spoke. Professional despite the way it fractured at the edges. Kwang Sun's body went absolutely still. The kind of stillness that predators achieve right before they strike or flee, when every muscle locks into readiness and the world narrows to a single point of focus. Bianca Roy emerged from the back corridor carrying a tray of velvet ring boxes, her movements careful and measured. She wore the boutique's standard uniform black dress, tailored blazer, name badge that identified her as a senior sales consultant. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, professional and unremarkable. She looked like any other woman navigating the careful choreography of luxury retail. Until her eyes met Kwang Sun's. The tray slipped from her hands. The sound of velvet boxes hitting marble floors should have been soft, cushioned. Instead, it rang out like gunshots in the suffocating quiet. Red velvet cases tumbled across white stone, spilling their contents diamond rings that caught the light and scattered it like broken promises across the floor. No one moved. Not the manager, not the invisible couple, not the bodyguards by the door, whose hands had instinctively moved toward weapons they didn't need. Bianca stood frozen, her hands still extended as if holding a tray that no longer existed, her eyes locked on the man she'd spent 5 years trying to forget and failing every single night. Kwang Sun's expression didn't change. Men in his position learned early how to turn their faces into masks, how to bury reactions beneath layers of control. But something in his posture shifted a barely perceptible lean forward, as if his body remembered her before his mind gave permission. Bianca. Her name left his mouth like a confession he'd never meant to make. She bent down immediately, kneeling to gather the scattered boxes, her hands trembling as she tried to restore order to chaos. I apologize, sir. That was unprofessional. Let me just leave it. His voice cut through her apology. Not cruel, but absolute. The voice that gave orders to men who'd kill to follow them. She stopped moving but didn't stand. Stayed there on her knees, surrounded by diamonds and velvet, looking up at him with an expression that held 5 years of rage and grief, and the terrible muscle memory of love that refused to die properly. Mrs. Choi, Kwang Sun said, without breaking eye contact with Bianca. I'd like Miss Roy to assist me, if that's acceptable. It wasn't a question. The manager understood power dynamics the way other people understood weather patterns. Of course, Bianca is one of our finest consultants. I'll give you privacy. She gestured to the bodyguards, to the other customers, orchestrating an evacuation disguised as discretion. The boutique emptied like water draining from a sink. Within 30 seconds, only Kwang Sun and Bianca remained in the showroom, separated by scattered diamonds and the wreckage of everything they'd once been to each other. Bianca finally stood, gathering the boxes with hands that had stopped shaking through sheer force of will. When she spoke, her voice had found its professional register again, though it cost her something visible to maintain it. What kind of statement did you want the ring to make? Kwang Sun looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time in 5 years, catalogued the changes, the way grief had carved new lines around her eyes, the way survival had taught her to stand differently, more defensive, less open, the way she held herself like something that had learned not to break because breaking was a luxury she couldn't afford. I wanted it to say that some men trade their souls for power, he said quietly, and some women pay the price for loving them. Before Bianca could respond, before she could decide whether to slap him or scream at him, or simply walk away, a small voice called from the back corridor. Mama, you dropped your tray. I heard it from the workshop. Are you okay? And Beatrice stepped into the showroom, sketchbook clutched in her small hands, her dark eyes landing on Kwang Sun's face with the unsettling recognition of someone seeing a ghost they'd only met in dreams. If you can't stand people who think fear earns respect, smash that like button right now. Let's show them that real respect is earned, not taken. Because Kwang Sun's about to learn that the hardest battles aren't won with violence, they're won with truth. And the truth just walked into the room carrying a sketchbook. Kwang Sun had faced down rival syndicate bosses across negotiation tables slick with implied threats. He'd stared into the eyes of men seconds before ordering their deaths, watched recognition and terror bloom in equal measure, and never once flinched. Fear was a language he spoke fluently, a currency he traded in, a weapon he wielded with the precision of a surgeon and the indifference of a machine. But when Beatrice stepped into the showroom, her small sneakers squeaking slightly on the marble floor, something in his chest cracked open like ice breaking under sudden pressure. She was tiny. That was his first coherent thought, stripped of all the careful calculation he usually wrapped around observations. Just tiny. 7 years old, maybe 8. With her mother's curls pulled into 2 puffs on either side of her head, secured with blue hair ties that had seen better days. She wore denim overalls over a white shirt, one strap twisted, and carried her sketchbook the way other children carried security blankets pressed against her chest like a shield made of paper and secrets. Bianca moved immediately, her body positioning itself between her daughter and Kwang Sun with the unconscious geometry of protection. "Beatrice, sweetheart, go back to the workshop. Mama's helping a customer." But Beatrice wasn't looking at her mother. She was looking at Kwang Sun with the unnerving focus of a child who hadn't yet learned that some things were too dangerous to stare at directly. Her dark eyes, his eyes, he realized with a jolt that felt like voltage through water, tracked from his face down to his neck, to the geometric mandala that crawled up from his collar like sacred architecture rendered in ink. She tilted her head, studying the pattern with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle they'd been working on for years. Kwang Sun tried to maintain the mask, tried to access the cold distance he'd perfected over a decade of surviving in a world where emotion was liability and love was leverage. But his hands betrayed him, gripping the edge of the display case hard enough that his knuckles went white beneath the tattoos that marked them. "You," Beatrice said, her voice small but certain. "You have the flower." Bianca's hand shot out, gripping her daughter's shoulder with barely contained panic. "Beatrice, don't bother the customer. We talked about this. Some people don't like—" "It's not bothering," Kwang Sun said, his voice rougher than he intended. He crouched down slowly, carefully, the way you might approach something wild and precious and easily startled. Brought himself to her eye level, though everything in his training screamed that lowering yourself made you vulnerable, made you weak. He didn't feel weak. He felt terrified in a way that bullets and blades and blood had never made him feel. "What flower?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the chaos rioting through his chest. Beatrice looked at her mother, silently asking permission. Bianca's face had gone ashen, her professional composure crumbling like sandcastles against tide. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not approval, but resignation. The little girl opened her sketchbook with the reverence of someone revealing something sacred, flipped past drawings of cats and houses, and what looked like her classroom, past wobbly attempts at spelling her name, past watercolor experiments that bled across pages, stopped on a drawing that made the air leave Kwang Sun's lungs in a rush. The geometric mandala, his neck tattoo, rendered in careful pencil strokes by a 7-year-old's hand, imperfect but unmistakable. The interlocking triangles that formed the sacred flower pattern, the specific configuration that marked him as bloodsworn to the Silver Lotus Syndicate. The design that had taken a master artist 12 hours to ink into his skin, that he'd earned through violence and loyalty and choices he could never undo. She'd drawn it. Somehow, impossibly, she'd drawn it. "I see it in my dreams sometimes," Beatrice explained, holding the sketchbook up for him to examine more closely. "The flower that makes patterns. It spins and spins and then I wake up. Mama says dreams are just our brains being silly, but this one feels important." Kwang Sun's hand trembled as he reached out to touch the page, stopping himself at the last second. He had no right to touch anything this innocent, this pure. His hands were weapons, tools for destruction. They didn't get to touch drawings made by children who dreamed in geometric patterns they shouldn't know existed. "It's beautiful," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're very talented." Beatrice beamed with the uncomplicated joy of a child receiving praise. And the expression was so achingly familiar, the way her whole face lit up, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners that Kwang Sun had to look away, before the crack in his chest split open completely. "Mama teaches me," Beatrice said proudly. "She says art is how we tell the truth when words are too small. Do you like art?" The question was so innocently delivered, so free of the weight it carried. Kwang Sun thought about Bianca's hands guiding him across canvas 5 years ago, teaching him to paint during stolen hours when he could pretend to be someone who created instead of destroyed. Thought about the watercolor he'd kept hidden in his safe, the only beautiful thing he'd ever made, now probably rotted with age and regret. "I used to," he said carefully. "Your mama was an excellent teacher." Bianca made a sound small, wounded, and turned away, busying herself with arranging the velvet boxes she'd retrieved from the floor. But her shoulders were rigid, her movements too precise, the body language of someone barely holding themselves together. Beatrice studied him with the unnerving perception that children sometimes possess, the ability to see past performance to truth. "You look sad," she observed. "Did something bad happen to you?" "Beatrice." Bianca's voice was sharp now, protective instinct overriding professional courtesy. "That's not an appropriate question for customers." "It's okay," Kwang-sun said, still crouched at Beatrice's level, still trapped in the gravity of her innocent attention. He wanted to tell her the truth. That yes, something bad had happened to him. Many bad things. That he'd become the bad thing that happened to other people. That looking at her was like staring into an alternate timeline where he'd made different choices and been worthy of the miracle standing in front of him. Instead, he said, "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. And those mistakes have consequences that last a long time." Beatrice considered this with the seriousness of someone trying to understand adult logic. "Mama says mistakes are okay if you try to fix them. That's what apologies are for." The simplicity of her worldview, the belief that apologies could fix what violence had broken, that trying was enough to earn redemption would have been laughable if it wasn't so devastating. Kwang-sun had made choices that no apology could touch, had burned bridges so thoroughly that even the ashes had scattered. But looking at Beatrice, at this small person who somehow carried his patterns in her dreams and his eyes in her face, he felt something he'd thought the syndicate had beaten out of him years ago, the desperate, animal need to protect something more important than power. "Your mama is very wise," he said softly. Then, because he couldn't help himself, because 5 years of questions demanded at least one answer. "How old are you, Beatrice?" 7 3/4, she announced, with the precision that only children find important. "My birthday is April 17th. Mama says I was born at sunrise, which means I'm lucky. April 17th. 9 months after the last night he'd spent with Bianca. 9 months after he'd destroyed everything good in his life to save her from the bomb meant for him. The mathematics of paternity crashed over him with the force of physical violence. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was certainty, written in genetic code and geometric patterns that haunted a 7-year-old's dreams. Kwang-sun stood up slowly, his legs unsteady, his carefully constructed world reshaping itself around this new, impossible truth. He looked at Bianca, who was watching him with an expression that held grief and fury and bitter vindication. "You left," her eyes said. "You destroyed us and walked away. You don't get to claim her now." "Bianca," he started, his voice breaking on her name. "Don't." The single word was sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't you dare. Not here. Not now. Beatrice is innocent, but the world she's about to enter isn't. If you believe children should be protected from the mistakes of their parents, comment, 'Protect the innocent' below. Because what happens next will test whether Kwang-sun is still capable of doing the right thing, even if the right thing costs him everything." 5 years ago, Kwang-sun had believed that love could exist in the margins of violence, that he could compartmentalize his life into clean sections, the syndicate over here, Bianca over there, and never let the blood from one stain the other. He'd been catastrophically wrong. The bullet had been small, unremarkable. A 9mm round, standard issue for the kind of work the Silver Lotus did when negotiation failed, and an example needed to be made. Someone had placed it carefully on the driver's seat of Bianca's decade-old Hyundai, positioned so she'd see it the moment she opened the door. Not hidden, not threatening through subtlety. A message written in brass and lead. "We know where she is. We know what she means to you. We can reach her whenever we want." Kwang-sun had found it during one of his routine security checks. The paranoid sweeps he'd started doing 3 months into their relationship, when he realized that loving her had created a vulnerability he couldn't armor plate. He'd been checking her car in the parking garage beneath her apartment building, running his hands under seats and wheel wells, when his fingers closed around the round. For 30 seconds, he'd stood there in the fluorescent-lit silence, holding the bullet like it was a grenade with the pin already pulled. Understanding with perfect, devastating clarity what it meant. The Han clan knew about Bianca, which meant his own syndicate knew about Bianca, which meant she'd been entered into the equation of his value and his loyalty, transformed from person into leverage, from woman he loved into weapon that could be used against him. He'd made it to the stairwell before vomiting, his body rejecting the reality his mind had already accepted. Then he'd sit on the cold concrete steps and do the math. Option 1. Increase her security. Higher protection. Move her somewhere safe, which would only confirm her importance. Paint a larger target on her back, and ensure that every enemy he'd ever made would see her as the key to destroying him. Option 2. Eliminate the threat. Find out who'd placed the bullet. Kill them. Kill their families. Salt the earth where they'd walked. Which would start a war the Silver Lotus couldn't win. And even if they could, there would always be another bullet, another threat, another enemy who'd learned the lesson that Dang Kwang-sun had a weakness that bled. Option 3. Make her irrelevant. Remove her from the equation entirely. Destroy what they had so thoroughly that no one would believe she mattered anymore. He'd chosen option 3 because he was a coward who called it sacrifice. The next evening, he'd let himself into her apartment, using the key she'd given him 3 months prior, back when giving him access to her space had felt like trust instead of tactical error. She'd been in the kitchen, singing off-key to some American pop song while making dinner pasta, because it was Thursday and Thursday was pasta night in the small routines they'd built together. She'd smiled when she saw him, the kind of smile that lit up her whole face, unguarded and genuine. "You're early. I haven't even started the sauce yet. There's wine in the fridge if you want to. We need to talk." He'd kept his voice flat, emotionless. The voice he used for business, for orders, for moments when feeling anything was a liability. Her smile had faltered. "Okay. Is everything all right?" He'd forced himself to look at her, really look at her, memorizing details he'd need to survive on later. The paint stain on her favorite cardigan that she'd never been able to wash out. The way her hair fell across her forehead when she was worried. The small scar on her chin from a childhood accident she'd told him about while they lay tangled in her sheets, sharing histories like they had infinite time. "This isn't working," he'd said. Each word felt like swallowing glass. "Us. Whatever this is, it needs to end." Bianca had gone very still, the wooden spoon in her hand dripping marinara sauce onto the floor in slow drops that sounded like a countdown. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I've been slumming." He'd rehearsed this part, practiced the cruelty until it sounded convincing. "You're a nice distraction, Bianca. Good for stress relief. But you're not..." He'd paused, let the silence build. "You're not the kind of woman a man like me ends up with." Her face had done something terrible, then cycled through confusion to hurt to dawning, devastating comprehension. "You don't mean that, don't I?" He'd walked to her bookshelf, picked up the small watercolor he'd painted for her birthday, a clumsy rendering of the view from her window. He'd been so proud of it, of creating something instead of destroying for once. He'd torn it in half, let the pieces flutter to the floor. This was fun, past tense. But I have responsibilities, a position to maintain. And maintaining it means making choices about who I'm seen with. Seen with. She'd repeated the words like they were in a language she didn't speak. "Kwang-sun, what happened? Yesterday you were talking about..." Her voice broke. "You said you'd never felt this way before. You said I made you want to be different. I lied." The lie was the truest thing he'd said. He had lied was lying now, but not about his feelings. About his strength. About his ability to protect her while staying in his world. "You were convenient, available, but I'm being arranged into a marriage that actually matters. Political alliance. The kind of thing that builds empires instead of wasting time playing house with a woman who teaches finger painting to kids." The contempt he forced into those last words had landed like a physical blow. He'd watched her flinch, watched her hand move instinctively to her stomach as if she'd been punched. "Get out." Her voice had been steady despite the tears starting to track down her face. "Get out of my home." Gladly. He'd walked toward the door, each step requiring more willpower than any act of violence he'd ever committed. His hand was on the doorknob when her voice stopped him. "I don't believe you." She'd said it quietly, but with absolute conviction. "I don't believe that you're capable of faking what we had. I saw you, Kwang Sunday. The real you. The man who painted with me, who cried when I told you about my father dying, who... You saw what you wanted to see." He turned back, forced himself to look at her crumbling, to witness the destruction he was causing and not run from it. "I'm a criminal, Bianca. I hurt people for money. I've killed people for disrespecting my boss. Did you really think I was capable of love? That's adorable, almost sweet in its naivety." He'd left then, before his resolution failed, before he told her the truth and made everything worse. Walked down the stairs instead of taking the elevator. Needed the time to decompose his face from the mask back into something that could feel. In his car, he'd sat in the dark parking garage for 3 hours, staring at the small square of rice paper in his wallet. His first tattoo, not the mandala that marked his rank, but a tiny geometric flower he'd gotten at 17, before the syndicate, before the violence, when he'd still believed beauty could exist without permission. Bianca had traced it once, that small hidden tattoo on his ribs, and said, "This one's different from the others. This one you chose for yourself." He'd clutched that memory like a lifeline while listening to his phone buzz with her calls, 17 of them, before she stopped trying, while watching the security feed he'd hacked that showed her collapse on her kitchen floor, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, while hating himself with a purity of emotion that almost felt like redemption. The next morning, his informants confirmed she'd quit her teaching job, broken her lease, and disappeared. Good. That was good. She was running, which meant she was surviving, which meant he'd succeeded in making himself unworthy of her. He'd gotten spectacularly drunk that night and burned the watercolor painting he'd kept his version of the one he'd destroyed in front of her, watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash, destroying the evidence that Dang Kwang-sun had ever been capable of creating something gentle. What he hadn't burned was the rice paper, the reminder of his first tattoo, the piece of himself he'd chosen before the syndicate had chosen him. He'd kept that, hidden in his wallet like a photograph of a life he'd murdered to save. And for 5 years, he'd told himself it had been worth it, that she was alive somewhere, safe, building a life that didn't include him. That sacrifice was its own kind of love. That destruction could be devotion. He'd been wrong about that too, because she hadn't run far enough. And she'd been carrying something more precious than her own life, something he'd created and abandoned without ever knowing it existed. Standing in the jewelry boutique, watching Beatrice draw his patterns in her innocent sketchbook, Kwang-sun finally understood the full cost of his cowardice. He hadn't saved Bianca. He'd just made her survive him alone. Bianca straightened her blazer with movements that were too precise, too controlled. The kind of physical composure people adopted when falling apart wasn't an option. When survival meant performing normalcy until the performance became indistinguishable from reality. "Beatrice, sweetheart," she said, her voice carefully modulated into something approaching maternal calm. "Why don't you go finish your homework in the back office? Mama needs to help this gentleman complete his purchase." Gentleman. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, rippling with all the things she wasn't saying. Not the man who destroyed me. Not the father you've never known. Just gentleman, a professional courtesy extended to dangerous customers who paid well and asked a few questions. Beatrice looked between them with the unsettling perception of children who absorb adult tension like secondhand smoke. "But I wanted to show him my other drawings. I have more flowers. Later." Bianca's hand on her daughter's shoulder was gentle but immovable. "This is work time. You understand." Beatrice nodded, clutching her sketchbook tighter, and shuffled toward the back corridor. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at Kwang-sun with an expression that held no fear, only curiosity tinged with something that looked heartbreakingly like recognition. Then she was gone, and the silence that remained felt like the aftermath of an explosion, all ringing ears and displaced air, and the sense that nothing would ever be structurally sound again. Bianca moved behind the display case, putting glass and precious stones between them like a barricade. When she spoke, her voice had found its professional register completely smooth, practiced, emptied of anything personal. "You mentioned an engagement ring, something that makes a statement." She pulled out a leather-bound catalog, opened it to a marked page with the efficiency of someone who'd already anticipated his needs and hated herself for it. "Given your requirements, I'd recommend our Heritage Collection. These pieces are designed for high-profile unions. Strategic marriages, the kind where the ring matters more than the person wearing it." The bitterness in that last sentence was almost invisible, a grace note of pain beneath the professional presentation. Almost invisible, but Kwang-sun had spent 6 months learning to read her, and some translations you never forgot. She turned the catalog toward him. The diamond stared back like accusations rendered in carbon and light. Each piece was spectacular in the way that weapons are spectacular, beautiful, precise, designed to make an impact. "This one," Bianca said, tapping a photograph of a ring that looked more like a declaration of war than a promise of love, "is 3 carats, emerald cut, VS1 clarity. The band is platinum with micro-pavé detailing. Very popular with clients who need to communicate wealth and status. It says, 'I can afford to own beautiful things.' It says nothing about actually valuing them." Kwang-sun studied the ring, then studied Bianca. Her face remained professionally neutral, but her fingers trembled slightly against the catalog page. "You've become quite skilled at understanding what these rings communicate. I've had 5 years to learn the language of empty gestures." She pulled out another catalog, flipped to a different section. "If you want something more aggressive, something that communicates dominance rather than partnership, we have this piece. 5 carats, 3-stone setting. The side stones are smaller, subordinate to the center stone. Very popular with clients who view marriage as acquisition rather than union." The subtext was so sharp it could draw blood. Kwang-sun let it land, let it cut, because he deserved every wound she was willing to inflict. "What about this one?" He pointed to a ring in the corner of the page, ostentatious, baroque, more metal than stone. A ring that screamed insecurity and compensation. "Excellent choice for your needs," Bianca said, and the professional mask slipped for just a second, revealing something raw beneath. "That's 7 carats, but poorly proportioned. All flash. No substance. Perfect for someone who mistakes size for significance. The woman wearing this would be uncomfortable, but visibility matters more than comfort in these arrangements, doesn't it?" She was talking about the ring, She was talking about their entire history. The double meaning hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither of them could extinguish. Kwang Sun leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Tell me about the woman who should wear a ring like this. I wouldn't presume to know your fiancée. You know exactly who she is. He kept his tone level, non-threatening, but insistent. The Han clan's daughter. You read the society pages. You know what kind of woman agrees to marry someone like me. Bianca's professional composure finally cracked, just enough to let truth leak through. Fine, you want me to tell you? She's beautiful in the way. Magazine covers define beautiful everything surgically perfected, nothing authentic remaining. She posts photos of charity galas while her family runs protection rackets that destroy small businesses. She collects designer handbags and has never worked a day in her life, because work is what lesser people do. She'll wear your ring like a trophy and cheat on you with your rivals because faithfulness is also what lesser people do. Her hands were shaking now, gripping the catalog edge. She is literally everything I'm not, which I suppose is exactly what you want. Someone who won't make the mistake of actually loving you. The words hung between them like broken glass, sharp and impossible to navigate around. Kwang Sun absorbed them without flinching. You're right, he said quietly. She's nothing like you. She's never painted anything, never taught children, never looked at me like I could be better than what I am. She'll never ask me to choose love over survival because she doesn't believe in love at all. Just transactions, just strategic alliances, just empty gestures wrapped in expensive metal. Then you've found your perfect match. Bianca closed the catalog with enough force to make the sound snap through the boutique. Shall I have this size? We'll need a few days for. What kind of ring would you choose? The question escaped before he could stop it, before his self-control could strangle the desperate need to know. If you were buying something that mattered, what would you pick? Her eyes finally met his, really met his, and the grief there was oceanic. I would choose the smallest one in the case, the one no one notices, because love shouldn't announce itself like a hostile takeover. It should be quiet, certain, something you choose every day, not something you display to prove you can afford it. She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But men like you don't want to be small and certain. You want statements. You want everyone to know you own beautiful things, even if you have no idea how to care for them. The accusation was so precise it felt surgical. Kwang Sun knew she wasn't talking about rings anymore. Hadn't been talking about rings this entire conversation. I'm starting to realize, he said carefully, that ownership isn't the same as earning. That buying something doesn't mean you deserve it. That some things some people should never be reduced to transactions at all. Fascinating timing for that epiphany. Bianca pulled out an order form, her movements mechanical. 6 years too late, but better late than never, I suppose. Shall I process your purchase? The Han daughter is expecting her ring, isn't she? Wouldn't want to keep your strategic alliance waiting. Kwang Sun looked at the catalog of expensive emptiness, then at Bianca, at the woman who'd once believed he could be more than the sum of his violence, who'd paid for that belief by raising their daughter alone while he played emperor in a kingdom built on blood and broken promises. The ring was supposed to secure his empire. Seal the truce with the Han clan. Give him the political alliance he needed to maintain power in Seoul's criminal underworld. But looking at Bianca, at the careful way she'd learned to hide her pain behind professional courtesy, at the life she'd built in the wreckage he'd left behind, Kwang Sun realized that empire had cost him the only kingdom that ever mattered. This marriage is a business deal, treating people like property. If you believe love shouldn't be for sale, hit subscribe. Let's build a community that values real connection over dirty money. Because Kwang Sun's about to make a choice that will change everything, and the clock is already counting down. Kwang Sun couldn't stop looking at the back corridor where Beatrice had disappeared, couldn't stop doing the arithmetic that kept arriving at the same impossible sum. 7 3/4 years old. Born in April. 9 months after the night he'd set fire to everything they'd built together and walked away convinced he was saving her. The math was screaming at him. Had been screaming since Beatrice had shown him that drawing, but his mind kept circling it like a wound he was afraid to touch directly. I need to see her again, he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. The girl, Beatrice. Bianca's professional mask shattered completely. Absolutely not. I just want to ask her about the drawing. No, the word was sharp enough to cut. You don't get to walk back into our lives and start making demands. You don't get to be curious about my daughter. You lost that right 5 years ago when you called me a convenient distraction and destroyed a painting I'd watched you pour your heart into. Our lives, not my life and her life. The pronoun choice wasn't accidental, and they both knew it. Bianca. Mr. Dang. She used his formal name like a weapon, like distance she could enforce through title and courtesy. I believe we should finalize your purchase and allow you to leave. I'm sure your fiancé is expecting... Please. The word came out like something breaking. Kwang Sun didn't beg. Hadn't begged since he was 17 and desperate and trying to negotiate his way out of syndicate initiation by offering anything else, any other way to prove his loyalty. But he was begging now. Just let me talk to her. 5 minutes, then I'll leave. I'll complete the purchase. I'll walk out and never come back. Just give me 5 minutes. Something in his voice must have communicated the desperation he was failing to hide, because Bianca's expression shifted from fury to something more complex, a mixture of fear and resignation and bitter curiosity about what he thought 5 minutes could possibly accomplish. Fine, she said finally. 5 minutes, but I'm staying in the room. And if you upset her, if you do anything to make her uncomfortable, you leave immediately. Are we clear? He nodded, not trusting his voice. Bianca disappeared into the back corridor, and Kwang Sun could hear the murmur of her voice, gentle and maternal, explaining that the customer had questions about her artwork. When they emerged, Beatrice was clutching her sketchbook like armor, her small face a mixture of excitement and caution. Children who grew up around danger learned to read adults the way soldiers read terrain, constantly assessing threat levels, calculating safe routes, understanding that survival sometimes meant knowing when to be small and quiet. Beatrice had that awareness in her eyes, that hypervigilance that came from absorbing more of the adult world's tension than she should have to carry. It broke something in Kwang Sun's chest to recognize that particular kind of vigilance, to see his own survival instincts reflected in a 7-year-old's careful posture. You wanted to see my drawings? Beatrice asked, her voice polite but guarded. Kwang Sun knelt down, bringing himself to her level, ignoring the way his expensive suit pressed against the boutique's marble floor. I did. The flower pattern you showed me earlier. You said it comes from your dreams? Beatrice nodded, opening the sketchbook to the page she'd shown him before. It started when I was little. Like, really little. Mama says I was maybe 3. I'd wake up and try to draw it, but my hands were too small and I couldn't make the shapes right. It made me so frustrated I'd cry. Behind her, Bianca had gone very still, her hands gripping the edge of the display case hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. She was watching this conversation like someone watching a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away, unable to stop it, already calculating the damage. Do you remember anything else about the dreams? Kwang Sun kept his voice gentle, non-threatening, even as his heart was trying to punch through his ribcage. Any other details? Beatrice tilted her head, considering. Sometimes there's a voice, deep, like thunder, but gentle. It sings something. I don't know the words, but the melody feels safe. Like someone is promising to keep the monsters away. She looked up at him with those devastating eyes, his eyes, and added, Mama says I have a very active imagination. Kwang Sun felt the blood drain from his face. The lullaby. He'd sung it exactly once, during one of their stolen nights together, when Bianca had asked about his childhood, and he'd told her about his grandmother, the only person who'd shown him gentleness before the syndicate had recruited him. His grandmother had sung that lullaby in her dialect, promising protection from demons and evil spirits. He'd sung it to Bianca while she fell asleep in his arms, her head on his chest, his hand tracing patterns on her spine. Geometric patterns. The mandala that would later be inked into his neck. Bianca made a sound small, choked and turned away, her shoulders shaking. Beatrice, Kwang Sun said carefully, can you show me any other drawings you've made of the flower? She flipped through the sketchbook eagerly, showing him page after page. The pattern in different variations, different angles, sometimes integrated into other images, a garden where the flowers all bore his tattoo's geometry, a night sky where stars arranged themselves into his sacred pattern, a portrait of her mother where the mandala formed a halo. I asked Mama once if she knew what it meant, Beatrice said, pointing to one particularly detailed rendering. She said some patterns don't need meanings, they just need to be beautiful. But I think it means something. I think it's trying to tell me something important. Kwang Sun's hands were shaking now, trembling with the weight of understanding that refused to be denied anymore. He looked at Beatrice, really looked at her, cataloging details he'd been too overwhelmed to process before. The shape of her face, the set of her jaw, the way her eyebrows drew together when she concentrated, the small scar on her chin that mirrored his own, from his own childhood fall. She had his eyes, his grandmother's chin, his nose, the particular way his mouth had curved before the syndicate had taught him to weaponize his expressions. She had his patterns in her dreams and his song in her memory and his blood in her veins. April 17th. 9 months after he'd walked away. Born at sunrise, which meant lucky, which meant Bianca had labored alone through the night, bringing their daughter into the world without him, surviving the violence of birth the way she'd survived the violence of his abandonment. Bianca, he said, standing up slowly, his legs unsteady. We need to talk, privately. We have nothing to discuss. Her voice was brittle, defensive. You've seen the drawings. Your 5 minutes are up. Please complete your purchase so we can close this transaction. She's mine. The words came out raw, undeniable. Not a question anymore. A statement of fact that couldn't be negotiated around. Beatrice, she's my daughter. Bianca's face went through something catastrophic, denial crashing into fury, crashing into fear, crashing into the terrible relief of a secret that had been crushing her for 7 years, finally being spoken aloud. You don't get to, she started, but her voice broke. You don't get to walk in here after 5 years and claim the timeline. Kwang Sun kept his voice low, aware of Beatrice watching this exchange with growing concern. April 17th. 7 3/4 years old, 9 months after I left. She has my eyes, Bianca, my grandmother's face. She dreams of my tattoo. She remembers my grandmother's lullaby. The math isn't complicated. Mama? Beatrice's small voice cut through the tension. Why is the customer upset? Did I do something wrong with my drawings? Bianca moved immediately, crouching down to gather Beatrice into her arms, positioning her body between her daughter and Kwang Sun like a physical barrier. No, baby. Your drawings are perfect. You did nothing wrong. Nothing is ever your fault. Do you understand me? The emphasis on that last part was directed at Kwang Sun, an accusation and a warning wrapped in maternal protection. Beatrice hugged her mother but kept her eyes on Kwang Sun, studying him with that unnerving perception. You look like you're going to cry, she observed. Adults don't usually cry in jewelry stores. She was right. Kwang Sun could feel moisture tracking down his face. Tears he hadn't authorized. Emotion leaking through carefully constructed defenses like water through cracked concrete. He'd cried exactly 3 times since joining the syndicate. Once when his grandmother died, once the night he left Bianca, and now, standing in a boutique, surrounded by symbols of empty promises, looking at the daughter he'd never known existed. Sometimes, he said, his voice wrecked. Adults cry when they realize they've made terrible mistakes. When they understand they've lost something precious because they were too afraid to hold on to it. Beatrice considered this with the gravity of someone trying to decode adult complexity. Mama cries sometimes too, late at night when she thinks I'm sleeping. She looks at old photos and cries. The moment shattered like dropped crystal when the boutique's entrance doors opened with enough force to trigger the security chime's distressed beeping. 3 men entered with the kind of aggressive casualness that announced they didn't need permission to be anywhere. That the world rearranged itself around their convenience rather than the other way around. Kwang Sun recognized them immediately. Han Clan enforcers. The kind deployed when the family wanted to remind someone that courtesy was optional but compliance wasn't. They wore expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the tactical bulk underneath men who'd learned to navigate luxury spaces but would always move like the violence they were paid to deliver. The one in front was someone Kwang Sun particularly despised. Park Ji-hoon, the Han daughter's personal security chief and rumored lover, though everyone pretended not to notice that particular complication. He had the kind of face that looked like it was perpetually sneering. Features arranged into permanent contempt for anything that didn't reflect his own self-importance. Dang, Ji-hoon called out, his voice carrying the false bonhomie of men who mistake aggression for charisma. Your assistant said we'd find you here. The heiress was getting concerned about the delay. It's been almost an hour. How complicated is selecting a ring? The heiress. That's what the Han clan called her, never by her actual name, just her function, her position in the family hierarchy. As if being born into power was the only identity that mattered. Kwang Sun straightened, instinctively positioning himself between the enforcers and Bianca, though he tried to make the movement look casual. I'm conducting business. Your concern isn't required. Concern? Ji-hoon's laugh was theatrical, performed for his companions. More like quality control. The heiress wants to make sure you're selecting appropriately. Can't have you picking something beneath her standards. His eyes had found Bianca now, sweeping over her with the kind of assessment that reduced people to inventory valued, appraised, and usually found wanting. His gaze caught on her name badge, then traveled deliberately down and back up, lingering in a way that made his intentions clear. Though I can see why you're taking your time, Ji-hoon continued, his smile turning predatory. The help here is certainly scenic, above average for retail workers anyway. Bianca's face remained professionally neutral, but Kwang Sun saw her hands tighten around Beatrice, saw the way she shifted slightly to place more of her body between her daughter and these men. The body language of someone who'd learned to recognize a threat before it fully materialized. Gentlemen, Bianca said, her voice steady despite the tension radiating through her frame. I'll need to ask you to wait outside if you're not making a purchase. Boutique policy. We maintain client privacy during consultations. Ji-hoon's expression curdled. Policy? He took a step closer to the counter, invading space with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for doing so. Did you just try to give me instructions? Do you have any idea who I work for? I'm aware, Bianca said, not backing down despite the threat implicit in his posture. But this is still a private business, and Mr. Dang is still conducting a consultation. I'll have to insist. You'll insist? Ji-hoon's voice rose, theatrical outrage performed for his audience. You'll insist? He turned to his companions. Can you believe this? Some minimum wage counter girl thinks she can tell Han Clan security how to operate. Kwang Sun felt his hands curl into fists, and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded violence. But he forced himself to remain still, to let Bianca handle this her way first. She'd survived 5 years without his protection. She didn't need him charging in like she was helpless, but he was ready, coiled, waiting for the wrong word or wrong movement that would give him permission to act. Sir, Bianca tried again, her professional courtesy fraying at the edges. I'm simply asking you to respect the boutique's privacy policy. Once Mr. Dang completes his selection, you're welcome to. Mr. Dang doesn't need privacy to select jewelry for his future wife. Ji-hoon interrupted. He leaned against the display case with deliberate casualness, making himself comfortable in space that wasn't his. Unless there's something more than business happening here, that would be complicated, given his upcoming nuptials. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a deliberately set fire. One of the other enforcers snickered. Man can't even buy a ring without getting distracted. Maybe the heiress should be concerned. Beatrice, who'd been silent through this exchange, pressed closer to her mother. Kwang Sun saw her small hands clutching Bianca's blazer, and saw the way her earlier curiosity had transformed into wariness. She was reading the room the way children in unstable environments learn to read rooms, constantly calculating adult moods, anticipating escalation, preparing to make herself smaller if necessary. Ji-hoon's eyes tracked the movement, landing on Beatrice for the first time. His expression shifted into something uglier, contempt mixed with cruel amusement. Well, he said slowly. Didn't realize the help came with accessories. Got yourself a little sidekick there? He addressed Bianca directly now, his tone dripping with false sweetness. Couldn't afford childcare on a retail salary? Had to bring the kid to work? My daughter, Bianca said, each word carefully controlled, is waiting in the back office. She's not disrupting anyone's business. Your daughter. Ji-hoon repeated the words like he was tasting them, finding them amusing. Interesting. No ring on your finger, but you've got a kid. Let me guess, baby daddy couldn't handle the responsibility? Ran off and left you playing single mother while slinging diamonds to people who can actually afford them? The casual cruelty in his voice was almost impressive in its efficiency. Every word calculated to diminish, to reduce Bianca's existence to a stereotype he could mock with his companions. Kwang Sun felt something snap inside his chest. The control he'd been maintaining, the careful distance he'd forced himself to observe, shattered completely. But before he could move, before he could cross the space between himself and Ji-hoon and introduce the man's face to the marble floor, Ji-hoon took one more step toward Bianca and made everything exponentially worse. Though I have to say, Ji-hoon continued, his eyes on Beatrice now, his smile turning vicious. Pretty exotic-looking kid. Mixed, right? That curly hair, that skin tone. Couldn't keep it in your own race? Had to go sampling elsewhere? He turned to his companions. Bet she doesn't even know who the father is. Probably some... Finish that sentence, Kwang Sun said, his voice so quiet it was almost gentle. And I will personally ensure you never speak again. The temperature in the boutique dropped 20 degrees. Ji-hoon turned, and for the first time, seemed to register that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The sneer faltered, the bravado cracked, but the damage was done. Beatrice had heard every word, her young mind processing insults she was too innocent to fully understand but old enough to know were meant to hurt. Her small face had gone tight, confused, looking up at her mother for explanation or reassurance, or some way to make sense of why the men in expensive suits were being so deliberately mean. Bianca pulled Beatrice closer, her professional mask completely abandoned now, replaced by raw maternal fury barely contained. Get out, she said, her voice shaking with rage. Get out of this store right now or I'm calling the police. Ji-hoon recovered some of his confidence, propped up by his companion's presence and the knowledge that he represented Han Clan power. Call whoever you want, sweetheart. We're here on official business. Your little feelings don't override. Official business? Kwang Sun's voice cut through Ji-hoon's posturing like a blade through silk. You were sent to observe a transaction. Instead, you've insulted a civilian, threatened a child, and compromised the discretion this establishment promises its clients. He took one step forward, then another, closing the distance with controlled precision. Tell me, Ji-hoon, does the Han Clan know their security chief spends his time terrorizing retail workers and children? Or is this freelance cruelty? Jihoon's face flushed, caught between backing down and maintaining face in front of his subordinates. It was a joke. Light conversation. If she can't handle a little what? Kwang-soon was close enough now that Jihoon had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. A little racism? A little misogyny? A little child abuse disguised as banter? Which part exactly should she have found amusing? The other two enforcers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond their pay grade. One of them touched Jihoon's elbow, a silent suggestion to retreat, to leave before this turned into something that would require explanations to people neither of them wanted to explain things to. But Jihoon, drunk on his own sense of importance and unable to read the room's danger level, pushed forward instead of backing down. Listen, Dang, I don't know what your relationship is with the help here, but you're about to marry into the Han family. Maybe keep your priorities straight. Don't make this complicated over some. Kwang-soon's hand shot out, gripping Jihoon's throat with enough pressure to cut off air but not enough to crush. Yet, the movement was so fast that Jihoon's companions barely had time to react, hands moving toward weapons they wouldn't be fast enough to draw. That woman, Kwang-sun said softly, his face inches from Jihoon's reddening face. And that child are none of your concern. You will apologize to both of them. You will leave this establishment. And you will tell the heiress that the transaction is taking longer than anticipated because I'm reconsidering the entire arrangement. Are we clear? Jihoon tried to nod, the motion restricted by Kwang-sun's grip. When released, he staggered back, coughing, his hand moving to his throat. If you hate bullies who pick on service workers just because they have a little bit of power, hit that like button right now. Let's show that we stand with Bianca against toxic entitlement, because what happens next will determine whether Kwang-soon is still the man who walks away, or finally the man who stays and fights. Jihoon's face cycled through humiliation, fury, and calculation in the span of seconds. Men like him, men who'd built their identities on borrowed power, and the assumption that their employer's reputation would shield them from consequences, rarely knew how to process being physically dominated. It short-circuited their understanding of how the world worked. You just assaulted Han Clan security, Jihoon said, his voice raw from the pressure on his throat but already rebuilding his bravado. Over some retail worker and her. Careful, Kwang-sun interrupted, his voice still dangerously quiet. Very, very careful about the next words that leave your mouth. But Jihoon was too deep in his own wounded pride to recognize the warning for what it was. He straightened his suit jacket, trying to salvage dignity from humiliation, playing to his companions who were watching this unfold with increasing nervousness. The heiress needs to know about this, Jihoon said, pulling out his phone. She should know exactly where your priorities are before the wedding. Should know that you're willing to compromise a strategic alliance over some single mother working retail who couldn't keep her legs. Kwang-sun moved again, faster this time, his hand closing around Jihoon's phone and crushing it with enough force that the screen splintered and the casing cracked. The sound of breaking technology was almost musical, a small destruction that promised larger violence to come. No calls, Kwang-sun said. Not until we resolve the situation properly. Jihoon stared at his destroyed phone, at the pieces of expensive technology now rendered into trash, and something in his expression turned reckless. The kind of recklessness that came from being humiliated in front of subordinates, from having your authority challenged so completely that backing down felt worse than escalating. You know what? Jihoon's voice rose, theatrical and aggressive. I think the heiress deserves to know exactly what kind of man she's marrying. A man who throws away political alliances for... He turned toward Bianca, his movement sharp and aggressive, closing the distance between himself and the counter where she stood with Beatrice pressed against her side, for trash that should know its place. Kwang-sun's mind registered three things simultaneously. First, the ring catalog is still open on the counter. The 7-carat monstrosity that represented everything wrong with the life he'd built. A symbol of strategic alliance, of power consolidated through loveless union, of a future where he would wake up every morning next to someone who saw him as an asset rather than a person. The ring was beautiful in the way that weapons were beautiful, expensive, precise, and fundamentally designed to cause damage. It represented his slavery to the syndicate's expectations, to the endless calculation of power and position that left no room for anything as messy and unpredictable as actual human connection. Second, Bianca and Beatrice huddled together behind the counter. His daughter and she was his daughter. That truth was undeniable now pressed against her mother's side, her small face showing confusion and fear. Bianca's arms wrapped protectively around Beatrice, her body language screaming, "I will die before I let you hurt her." They represented everything he'd convinced himself he couldn't have. Everything he'd destroyed 5 years ago because he'd been too much of a coward to imagine a future where love didn't automatically mean death. They were his freedom, If he was brave enough to choose it. If he was willing to burn down the empire he'd built on their ashes. Third, and most immediately critical, Ji-hoon's hand reaching toward Beatrice. Not toward Bianca, toward the child. The movement was aggressive, meant to intimidate, to physically move Beatrice away from the counter as if she were an object that could be relocated at his convenience. His hand was already extending, already invading space that wasn't his, already making contact with Beatrice's small shoulder. Get this mud out of the way so we can... Kwang-soon's body reacted before his conscious mind authorized the movement. Years of syndicate training, of combat refined into instinct, of violence programmed into muscle memory so deep that thinking about it would only slow him down. He crossed the space between himself and Ji-hoon in less than a second. His hand intercepted Ji-hoon's wrist mid-motion, catching it with enough force that the crack of impact echoed through the boutique like a gunshot. The angle was perfect. The leverage precise, everything he'd learned about joint manipulation and pain compliance focused into a single, devastating hold. Ji-hoon screamed, high-pitched, shocked, the sound of someone discovering that actions had consequences after all. Kwang-sun twisted, applying pressure to the wrist in a way that sent Ji-hoon to his knees instantly. The man's face went white, then red, pain and shock fighting for dominance across his features. "I told you," Kwang-sun said, his voice still quiet but carrying a weight that made Ji-hoon's companions freeze with their hands halfway to their weapons. "To be very, very careful. Did you think I was making a suggestion?" "Let go," Ji-hoon gasped, his free hand clawing at Kwang-sun's grip. "You're breaking." "Not yet." Kwang-sun increased the pressure fractionally, just enough to make his point. "But I could, very easily. One more twist, and you'll never have full mobility in this hand again. Is that what you want? Is your pride worth permanent disability?" Kwang-sundae. Bianca's voice cut through his focus. Not pleading, not frightened, but firm. The voice of someone who needed him to see reason before he did something that couldn't be undone. "Not in front of Beatrice, please." He looked up, looked at his daughter's face, eyes wide, hands pressed against her mother's side, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, exactly. Something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. Understanding that he was dangerous, but that danger was currently aimed at someone who'd hurt them. Kwang-sun released Ji-hoon's wrist with a shove that sent the man sprawling on the boutique's marble floor. He turned to face Ji-hoon's companions, who'd managed to draw their weapons, now handguns held in shaking hands, pointed vaguely in his direction, but not with the confidence of men, certain they wanted to escalate this to lethal force. "Put those away," Kwang-sun said calmly. "Unless you want to explain to the Han clan why their security chief started a firefight in a civilian establishment over personal insults. How do you think that story ends for your careers?" The two enforcers looked at each other, looked at Ji-hoon still gasping on the floor, looked at Kwang-sun standing between them and the counter with the posture of someone who'd already calculated every possible outcome and decided he was comfortable with all of them. Slowly, uncertainly, they lowered their weapons. Ji-hoon managed to get to his knees, cradling his wrist against his chest. His face was a mess of pain and humiliation and rage that had nowhere productive to go. "This isn't over," he spat. "The heiress will hear about this. The Han clan will hear about this. You just ended your engagement and started a war over some... Say one more word about them." Kwang-sun interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that made Ji-hoon's companions take an involuntary step backward. "And what I just did to your wrist will look like gentle encouragement. Test me, please. I'm looking for an excuse." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Beatrice had gone still, processing this display of violence in her mother's workplace, trying to reconcile the man who'd been gentle with her drawings with the man who'd just put another man on the floor with clinical precision. Kwang-sun took one step toward Ji-hoon, then another, crowding into his space while he was still on his knees. "You will leave now. You will tell the heiress that I need more time to make my selection. You will not mention Miss Roy or her daughter in your report. You will pretend this interaction never happened, and in the future, when you see them anywhere, you will cross the street to avoid them. Are we absolutely, perfectly clear?" Ji-hoon nodded once, sharp and abbreviated, pain and pragmatism finally overriding pride. "Good." Kwang-sun straightened, stepping back to give Ji-hoon room to stand. "Now get out of my sight before I reconsider letting you leave with all your bones intact." The three men scrambled for the exit with none of the swagger they'd entered with, Ji-hoon still cradling his wrist, his companions supporting him on either side. The boutique doors closed behind them with a soft chime that sounded almost apologetic, as if the security system was embarrassed by their behavior. And then there was silence. Heavy, complicated silence. Kwang-sun turned to face Bianca and Beatrice, still huddled together behind the counter, and saw himself through their eyes. A man who'd just casually brutalized another human being in a jewelry store. A man whose violence was so practiced it looked choreographed. A man who'd claimed 5 minutes of conversation and instead delivered a masterclass in the kind of life he lived, the kind of world he operated in, the kind of world that bullets got left in cars to warn people away from. This guard just made a huge mistake. If you're ready to see a bully get what they deserve, comment "justice served" below. Because Kwang Sun just chose a side, and it isn't the one that comes with a ring and a strategic alliance. Now comes the hard part, living with that choice. The silence after the guard's departure felt like the aftermath of an explosion, ringing and hollow and full of displaced air that needed time to settle back into something breathable. Kwang Sun stood in the center of the boutique, his hands still trembling with residual adrenaline, staring at the two people who represented everything he'd convinced himself he couldn't have. Bianca was the first to move. She crouched down, bringing herself to Beatrice's eye level, her hands cupping her daughter's face with a kind of gentleness that made Kwang Sun's chest ache. "Baby, are you okay? Did that man scare you?" Beatrice shook her head, but her eyes were too wide, processing more than a 7-year-old should have to process. He was mean. About us. About my hair and my skin. "Why was he so mean, Mama?" "Some people," Bianca said carefully, choosing words that wouldn't damage while not lying about the world's cruelty, "are mean because they're small inside. Because making others feel bad is the only way they know how to feel big. But they're wrong. Do you understand?" Everything he said was wrong. The customer stopped him. Beatrice's gaze shifted to Kwang Sun, studying him with that unnerving perception. "You hurt that man. I heard something crack." Kwang Sun felt the weight of her observation like physical pressure. What could he say? That yes, he'd hurt Ji-hoon, and had been prepared to hurt him much worse. That violence was his primary language, the tool he'd spent 15 years perfecting. That he was exactly the kind of dangerous his daughter should learn to avoid. "I did," he said finally, because lying to her felt worse than the truth. "He was going to touch you, to push you away like you were..." He stopped, recalibrated. "Like you didn't matter. And that was unacceptable." "Because I matter?" Beatrice asked, her voice small but searching. "Because you matter more than anything in this room," Kwang Sun said, the words escaping before his defenses could stop them. "More than the diamonds. More than the transaction. More than any alliance or arrangement or strategic marriage. You matter because you exist. Because you're here. That's enough." Bianca made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob, and pulled Beatrice closer. "Sweetheart, why don't you go back to the office? I need to talk to the customer about some adult things." "Is he going to hurt you too?" Beatrice's question was direct, unfiltered by adult politeness or euphemism. "No," Bianca said immediately. Then more quietly, more honestly. "He already did that. A long time ago. But not with his hands." The accusation landed exactly where Kwang Sun deserved it. He absorbed it without defense, without excuse. Because what could he possibly say? That he'd destroyed her to save her? That his abandonment had been love disguised as cruelty? Every justification he'd constructed over 5 years sounded hollow when confronted with the reality of what his choices had cost. Beatrice looked between them, trying to decode adult complexity with a child's limited framework. Finally, she nodded and shuffled toward the back corridor, her sketchbook clutched against her chest. At the threshold, she paused, glancing back one more time. "Thank you," she said to Kwang Sunday, "for stopping that mean man. Even if you were scared doing it." Then she was gone, and Kwang Sun was alone with Bianca for the first time in 5 years, with nothing between them except broken glass, scattered diamonds, and the catalog of expensive lies still open on the counter. Bianca stood up slowly, her professional composure completely abandoned now. She looked exhausted, not the surface tiredness that came from a long shift, but the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been surviving on emergency reserves for years and had finally run out. "You need to leave," she said, but her voice carried no conviction, just resignation. "Before someone calls the police. Before this gets more complicated than it already is." "I'm not buying the ring," Kwang Sun said it like an announcement, like something that needed to be spoken aloud to become real. "I'm not marrying the Han daughter. I'm not completing the transaction." Bianca's laugh was bitter. "Congratulations on your sudden moral clarity. A little late, but better late than never, I suppose. Does the heiress know she's being dumped in a jewelry store? Or are you planning to devastate her the way you devastated me with maximum cruelty disguised as protection?" "I devastated you," Kwang Sun acknowledged, each word feeling like pulling shrapnel from an old wound. "Because I was a coward who thought destroying you was the same as saving you. I found a bullet in your car, meant for me. And instead of trusting you to decide your own level of acceptable risk, I made the decision for you. I staged the worst night of both our lives to force you away." Bianca went very still. "A bullet. In your driver's seat. Placed there by someone who wanted me to understand that they could reach you whenever they wanted. That you were leveraged. A weakness they could exploit. He forced himself to maintain eye contact, to witness the way his confession landed. I thought if I made you hate me, if I made you run, you'd be safe. You'd be free of me and everything I carried with me. I thought I was giving you a chance at a normal life. A normal life. Bianca repeated the words like they were in a foreign language. Kwang-sun, I was pregnant. I found out 3 days after you left. 3 days after you told me I was convenient and disposable and beneath your standards. I was pregnant and alone, and the man I loved had just told me I was worthless. The information hit Kwang-sun like a physical blow. You knew? When you already knew. No. The correction was sharp. I found out after. After you'd destroyed everything. After I'd spent 2 days crying so hard I couldn't breathe. After I'd quit my job because I couldn't face anyone who might ask questions about why I looked like someone had died. I took the test in a gas station bathroom, because I couldn't afford to miss work for a doctor's appointment I couldn't pay for because teaching art to underprivileged kids doesn't exactly come with premium health. Insurance. She was shaking now, 5 years of suppressed fury finally finding its voice. You want to know about my normal life? I spent 9 months terrified. Alone. Working 2 retail jobs because one wouldn't cover rent and prenatal care. I went into labor by myself. Took a taxi to the hospital by myself. Held my own hand during contractions because there was no one else to hold. I pushed our daughter into the world with strangers around me. And when they asked who to call, who should be there, I had no one. Because the man I loved had made it very clear that I was just convenient, just temporary, just trash that should know its place. Every word was a weapon, and Kwang-sun let them all land. Deserved every single one. And you know what the worst part was? Bianca's voice broke. When Beatrice was born, when they put her in my arms for the first time, she opened her eyes and looked at me with your eyes. Your exact eyes. And I loved her so much I thought my heart would explode. And I hated you so much I thought I'd die from it. Both feelings were so intense I couldn't tell them apart. Kwang-sun took 1 step toward her, then stopped, uncertain if he had any right to close the distance. I was wrong, he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. About everything. I thought I was protecting you. I was really just protecting myself from having to choose between the syndicate and you, from having to be brave enough to imagine a different life. And now? Bianca's laugh was hollow. Now you're going to choose something different? After 5 years? After I've built a life without you? After Beatrice has learned to live without a father? You're going to walk away from a strategic marriage and start a gang war because you suddenly developed a conscience in a jewelry store? No, Kwang-sun shook his head. I'm going to walk away from the strategic marriage and start a gang war because I just met my daughter. Because she draws my tattoos in her dreams and sings my grandmother's lullaby without knowing why. Because 3 men walked in here and threatened the 2 people who matter more than any empire I've built on bones and bad choices. He moved closer, slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted to. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking you to take me back or trust me or pretend the last 5 years didn't happen. I'm telling you that I don't want the ring for the Han daughter. I want to know why our daughter dreams in geometric patterns that match my ink. I want to know her favorite color and what she's afraid of, and whether she likes the same terrible morning cartoons I used to watch. His voice broke. I want to know everything I missed, everything I threw away because I was too much of a coward to fight for it. Bianca stared at him, tears tracking down her face now, her professional mask completely shattered. You don't get to walk back in, and... I know, Kwang-sun said. I know I don't get to decide anything. That's your choice. Her choice, when she's old enough to make it. I'm just telling you what I want, what I'm choosing, even if you choose to tell me to disappear forever. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and grief, and the terrible weight of choices that couldn't be unmade but maybe, possibly, could be survived. Finally, Bianca spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She asks about you sometimes, not directly. She's too smart for that, but she'll see other kids with their fathers and get quiet. Or she'll draw pictures of families and leave one figure incomplete. Just an outline, like she's waiting for someone to fill in the details. Kwang-sun felt something break open in his chest, not the crack from earlier, but a full structural collapse. What do you tell her? That her father loved her very much but couldn't stay. That sometimes people make impossible choices in impossible situations. That love isn't always enough to fix broken things. Bianca's hands were shaking. I've been lying to her for 7 years. Telling her that you didn't know about her, that if you'd known, everything would be different. I don't even know if that's true. It's true, Kwang-sun said with absolute certainty. If I'd known Bianca, if I'd known you were pregnant, there's no force on earth that could have kept me away. Not the syndicate, Not the Han clan. Not bullets or threats or blood oaths. Nothing. Kwang Sun pulled out his phone, the movement deliberate and final. His finger hovered over the contact labeled simply, Silver Lotus Command, the direct line to his second-in-command. The man who coordinated operations when Kwang Sun couldn't be reached. The man who would have to execute orders that would reshape the entire criminal landscape of Seoul. "What are you doing?" Bianca asked, watching him with an expression caught between hope and terror. "Making a choice I should have made 5 years ago." He pressed the dial, and the line connected on the second ring. "Boss." Kim Min-sok's voice was efficient, alert. "Ji-hoon just reported an incident at the boutique. Said there was a complication with Ji-hoon assaulted a civilian in my presence." Kwang Sun interrupted, his voice carrying the cold authority that made men twice his size fall into line. "He insulted a woman and her child. He compromised the discretion of a high-security transaction. And he's currently on his way to report a version of events that serves his interests, rather than truth." Silence on the other end. Min-sok was calculating, running scenarios, understanding that this conversation was heading somewhere that would require significant adjustments to existing operations. "I need you to intercept him before he reaches the Han compound," Kwang Sun continued. "I need you to retrieve any communications devices he's carrying, and I need you to make it very clear that his employment with Silver Lotus is terminated effective immediately. Severance package to be determined by how cooperative he is about keeping his mouth shut. Boss, if we terminate Han clan security without explanation, I'm getting to that." Kwang Sun closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what he was about to say, the magnitude of the choice he was making in a jewelry store, while his daughter drew pictures in the back room, and the woman he'd destroyed 5 years ago watched him burn down his empire. "Contact the Han family leadership. Tell them I'm respectfully withdrawing from the engagement arrangement. Tell them I'm grateful for the opportunity to build an alliance, but personal circumstances have made it impossible to proceed with the marriage." Personal circumstances. Min-sok's voice was carefully neutral, but Kwang Sun could hear the unasked questions underneath. "Boss, you understand what that means. The Han clan won't accept a broken engagement without retaliation." "Yes, I understand perfectly." Kwang Sun opened his eyes, looked at Bianca, at the way she was staring at him like he was either the bravest man she'd ever met or the most catastrophically stupid. "Which is why I need you to activate Protocol Fortress. Full defensive posture, triple security on all Silver Lotus holdings. Move the syndicate leadership to secure locations. And contact our allies in the Park and Choi families. Tell them war is coming and we'll need to know where they stand." Protocol Fortress was the contingency plan they developed for exactly this scenario, major conflict with a rival clan, the kind of war that would spill blood across Seoul's underworld and force everyone to choose sides. They'd practiced it in theory, run simulations, calculated acceptable losses. Kwang Sun had never actually thought he'd need to activate it. Certainly not over a broken engagement. Definitely not because he'd discovered he had a daughter and couldn't stomach the idea of building power on the foundation of her absence. "One more thing," Kwang Sun added, before Min-sok could respond. "I need personal security details on 2 civilians. A woman named Bianca Roy and her daughter Beatrice. The current location is Eternal Brilliance Jewelry Boutique, but I'll be sending you their home address. I want our best people. Discreet but comprehensive. 24-hour coverage. Anyone who approaches them with hostile intent answers to me personally." Now the silence on Min-sok's end was weighted with understanding, with the recognition that this wasn't just about broken engagements or clan politics. This was personal in a way that changed everything. "Understood, boss," Min-sok said finally. "But you need to know if the Han clan decides to make an example. If they target you directly, having civilians connected to you makes them vulnerable, yes. Which is why the security detail isn't optional." Kwang Sun's voice hardened. "And Min-sok? If anything happens to them because of choices I'm making tonight, there won't be enough of the Han clan left to bury. Make sure everyone understands that. Make sure it's in the official communication. These civilians are under Silver Lotus protection. Harming them is declaring war not just on me, but on everything we've built. I'll make it clear." A pause. "For what it's worth, boss, some things are worth going to war over." "I hope she is." "They are," Kwang Sun corrected softly. "Both of them." He ended the call and looked up to find Bianca staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite decode. Shock. Disbelief. Maybe the first fragile beginnings of something that might eventually become trust if he didn't destroy it again. "You just started a gang war," she said slowly, each word carefully articulated like she was testing their reality. "In a jewelry store. Because 3 men were rude to us." "No," Kwang Sun corrected, pocketing his phone. "I started a gang war because I spent 5 years building an empire on the foundation of the worst decision I ever made. Because I walked away from you and didn't know I was walking away from her. Because I just watched men threaten my daughter and realized that every choice I've made since I was 17 years old has been in service of power that means nothing if I'm not using it to protect the people who actually matter. He took one step closer, then another, closing the distance between them with the care of someone approaching something precious and easily broken. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to let me back into your life. I'm just asking if I can buy you and Beatrice dinner. If I can sit across from my daughter at a table and learn what she likes to eat. If I can start— His voice broke. If I can start being her father, even if I can never be your father, even if we can never go back to what we were. Bianca's hands were shaking, her professional composure completely abandoned to raw emotion. You don't understand what you're asking, what it means to let you into her life. She'll get attached. She'll start hoping. And if you disappear again, if the gang war gets too dangerous and you decide we're better off without you, I won't. The promise was absolute, carved from bone-deep certainty. I won't disappear. I won't decide what's best for you without asking. I won't make choices about her life without her mother's input. I'm done playing God with other people's happiness. I'm done thinking I'm protecting people by abandoning them. Pretty words, Bianca said, but her voice was softening, the fortress walls she'd built over 5 years starting to show cracks. You were always good with words when you wanted something. Do you remember what you said the first night we met? When did I give you my tea? That I couldn't take it, that I didn't deserve kindness from strangers. Kwang Sun remembered every word of that first conversation, and had replayed it countless times during the 5 years of her absence. And I said you didn't get to decide what you deserved, that I was giving it to you regardless. Bianca's eyes were wet now, tears tracking down her face unchecked. I believed you could be better than what the world told you to be. I saw something in you, some part that wanted gentleness even though you'd been trained to destroy. Was I wrong? Was that person ever really there? He was there, Kwang Sun said, his own voice rough with emotion he'd spent 5 years suppressing. He's still here, buried under a lot of violence and bad decisions, but still here, still wanting to paint, still wanting to protect instead of destroy, still wanting— He stopped, gathered courage, still wanting you, both of you. If you'll give me the chance to prove I can be the man you thought I was instead of the man I forced myself to become. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Somewhere in the back office, Beatrice was drawing geometric patterns in her sketchbook, humming her grandmother's lullaby, existing in innocent ignorance of the choice her mother was about to make. Finally, Bianca spoke. Dinner, one dinner, somewhere public, somewhere she feels safe. And if at any point she wants to leave, we leave. No questions, no pushing. She sets the pace. Not you, not me, her. Is that acceptable? More than acceptable. Kwang Sun felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking this time, but opening. Like a door sealed shut for years, finally giving way. Thank you. For the chance. For being willing to— Don't thank me yet, Bianca interrupted, but her voice held the first hint of something that might eventually become warmth. You haven't met 7-year-old Beatrice at a restaurant. She asks approximately 900 questions per meal, and has opinions about everything from napkin quality to the precise temperature soup should be served at. You're going to earn every minute of this dinner. Good, Kwang Sun said, and meant it with his entire being. I want to earn it. I want to know about the napkin opinions and the soup temperature requirements. I want to know everything. Bianca studied him for a long moment, and Kwang Sun forced himself to remain still under her assessment, to let her see whatever she needed to see to make this choice. One more thing, she said finally. The gang war, the Han clan. The violence that's coming because you walked away from that engagement. You keep it away from her. I don't care what you have to do. You keep that world away from my daughter. If I see one bullet, one threat, one hint that your choices are putting her in danger, you'll disappear with her and I'll never find you, Kwang Sun finished. I understand, and I'll do everything in my power to keep that world separate. But Bianca, you need to understand, the Han clan already knows she exists. Ji-hoon saw her, made comments about her. That information exists now, which is why I've arranged security. Discreet, professional, but comprehensive, to make sure that if anyone tries to use her as leverage against me, they fail spectacularly and visibly enough that no one else tries. Bianca's face went pale. You're telling me that by walking in here today, you've made her a target. I'm telling you she was always going to be a target once they figured out she mattered to me. And they would have figured it out eventually. Better that it happens now, when I can protect her, than later when I might not be prepared. He held her gaze. I won't let anything happen to either of you. That's not a promise. That's a fact. Anyone who wants to hurt you or Beatrice has to go through me first. And I've spent 15 years making sure that going through me is expensive, bloody, and ultimately unsuccessful. That's supposed to be comforting? But Bianca's voice held a note of grim humor, acknowledging the absurd reality they were navigating. It's supposed to be honest. Kwang Sun glanced toward the back corridor where Beatrice waited. Would it be okay if you ask her to dinner yourself? Bianca finished. Yes, but I'm coming with you, and remember she sets the pace. They walked toward the back office together, and Kwang Sun felt the weight of the moment settling into his bones. Tomorrow, war will start. The Han clan would mobilize. Seoul's underworld would fracture along new alliance lines. Blood would be spilled and territories would be contested, and everything he'd built over 15 years would be tested in ways it might not survive. But tonight, for the next few hours, he would sit across from his daughter and learn what she liked to eat. Tomorrow, he would be the White Wolf, feared enforcer of the Silver Lotus Syndicate, the man who'd started a war rather than complete a strategic marriage. Tonight, he was just Kwang Sunday, a father meeting his daughter for the first time. And between those two realities, he would have to figure out how to build a bridge that didn't collapse under the weight of violence and love existing in the same space. Kwang Sun chose a dangerous path to do the right thing. If you believe in second chances, even for the broken ones, subscribe to the channel, because this story isn't over, it's just beginning. The war is coming, but so is redemption. And sometimes, the most powerful empire you can build isn't made of territory and blood oaths. It's made of dinner conversations and napkin opinions, and a little girl who draws your tattoos in her dreams because she was always meant to be yours. Until next time, remember that family is the only empire worth building,